ki te matukai hohoreni, whangainga, ki te matuai, whakanumia, te hi Māori ora. Karoria ki te atua, te kaihanga te kai whakamare, ki kai hungai o te ora. E monga rongo ki tōna iwi, ki rongo ki tēnā mā. E hō mā, e rana tēnā mā, nō mai haere mai ki tēnei whare karakia, te whare karakia o hori tapu. Welcome to you all to St George's Anglican Church, and welcome to tonight's lecture. It's great to have you here. I begin each of these talks by quoting again from Paul's letter to Romans, the passage that Te Hāhi Mihinare quoted on the rules of engagement. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him drink, which is on our window. As a way of reminding us why we are here, that so often in our society we kind of get into them and us, and this is actually, when Paul said that, it's very difficult to have enemies when you're giving them drink and food. So it's a way of breaking down those boundaries and seeing our common humanity and telling each other our stories so that together we can work out a better future for each other. So that's what these lectures, these talks are about. So welcome to you all. It's great to have you here. I'll go back to my script. Just a few reminders. So if you we're in COVID, really back into COVID stuff. So you need to scan as you came in, or write on the thing, or if you do manual sign-in, which I had to do because I forgot to scan. If you have a phone with you and you can put it on silent or turn it off, now it's good times. You don't want to be interrupted by that. The toilets, if you need them, if it goes on for too long, back down the passageway, diagonally across the lounge and just follow the signs. If you're in a hall, you're in the wrong place. We are recording tonight, so I need to say that so you know that this will be recorded. So it'll be recorded on sound, and I'm going to have another crack at recording a video. So this, with luck, so the last two lectures are available on our YouTube page, on our YouTube channel. The parish has a YouTube channel, A Gift of COVID. So this Anglican Parish of Gate Pass, you can search that on the YouTube, and the last two lectures are there. I'm not live streaming this one, so last time we live streamed it, but the quality of the video is much poorer than if I just record it. So I'm going to record it on my phone, and hopefully I can find it. It took me about a week to find the recordings on my phone. They just hid. And then I had to work out how to get them off my phone. That was about another week's work. So hopefully I'll be able to do it quick this time. So if you don't want to be in the recording, don't be in the front row, basically, that's what I'm saying. And if you don't want your voice recorded, don't make any comments or ask questions. It's my great pleasure to introduce the Rev Dr Hirini Kaa. Known Hirini for, it's probably almost exactly 17 years, it was 18 years since we first met. He was the kaiārahi for the Māori Ministry School, and I was the brand spanking new National Youth Facilitator for the Pākehā part of our church. And we had to work together because we were kind of national people representing the various youth ministry projects. And so the next 9 years, he and I worked a lot together, both on treaty kind of stuff, but I was part of the group that had any kind of visions to provide youth ministry training at a treaty kind of level, and I had a very small role in that, which gave me my pocket money to go overseas, various trips, various meetings. So how would I describe Hirini? Well, I mean, there's the obvious things that he's an historian. He's just published a book, so if you were here in time, there it is, still promoting it. And I encourage you to buy it and read it. So he's a published author. He's a media personality, so some of you may have watched the television series The Prophets, which Hirini was responsible for. He's currently working at Auckland University as the kaiārahi, which is the Pacific and Māori student support person, making it a safe place and to encourage them in their learning in that place. He has another done that kind of work. He's followed his father's footsteps in terms of nationally addressing domestic violence and sexual abuse, particularly in the Māori community, and is still involved in that market as well. So, how would I describe him generally? Incredibly passionate, particularly about things Māori, particularly Ngāti Porou, but he's willing to kind of broaden that out to Te Ao Māori as well. But he's also somebody who thinks big. He's not interested or happy just to kind of stay both in the status quo or in a particular project, but he wants to see where that will go and where our country will go and how we can build on what we have at the moment. And enormously creative. And so personally, although the Māori Anglican Church struggled with it, I thought that the Māori Rangatahi Ministry School was the most creative thing that we as a church were doing in our engagement with young people. And if you look at all the young Māori priests within the Māori Anglican Church at the moment, they all came through Te Māori. The Māori Anglican Church would look very different without that ministry. And that was his vision, his drive to make that happen. Providing a safe place for young people to engage in ministry while getting the training, both practical and theological, that went with that. It was an astounding thing. I just dreamed of being able to do something the same within my own part of the church. So I've been trying to get Hirini to come here and to talk about some of these things for the last couple of years. It didn't work last year, but this year I'm really glad that he's agreed to do that. And so please welcome my friends who's taught me a lot, particularly over those first 9 years, Rev Dr Hirini Kaa.
Mihi ki te whare karakere tūmei ki a hori taku. Mihi ki te whenua e taku ko nei. Mihi ki te kōrero tuku i ho o te whenua nei. Mō ngā tini reimata mō te koharo mō tēnā rā koutou. Kia koutou toa te hapurangatira a Kaitani. Kia hui te huaturangatira e John, kia hui hoki i Bonnie. Kia koutou i ngā whenua ngā kaunaki mō te ahiahi me, a Kaitani. Ko huirangi te mau, ko waifu te aua, ko Ngāti Porou, ko Hirini Kaa ahau, tēnā koutou. Kia ora, good evening. It's a real honour and a pleasure to be here. Thank you, John, for your generous welcome, which I can't possibly live up to. Except for one part, I am very Ngāti Porou. Also a descendant of Ngāti Kahungunu and Rongowhakaata, but my mouth is definitely Ngāti Porou. John said you'll have around 2 hours, which in my book is 2 days, but I'll try and keep it down. So please don't hesitate to interrupt as we go, and I'll hide my disappointment. When John invited me to come and have a corridor, I thought, yes, a captive audience. Nothing like Ngāti Porou, which is why I went to university life. It's been my real pleasure to work for several years now at the University of Auckland. I started off lecturing in history and theology. Lately, yes, I've been kaiārahi in the Faculty of Arts. That's the Māori and Pacific Advisor. I am going to tell this joke, John, despite the video, and I'm just hoping YouTube doesn't work. Kaiārahi is quite untranslatable, kind of means guide, isn't it? But I call it a Pākehā whisperer. I basically go to Pākehā staff and say, don't be racist. Try and settle them down. It's quite a challenge at our institutions. But I love working with our amazing colleagues. The reason I'm talking about it fondly is because I'm leaving shortly. And it is great. They were really generous. I decided not to continue in an academic role and instead I'm coming back to work for our church because like John, it's my calling, I like imagination and I like propulsion. So it'll be soon enough back in Pukehinahina. Yes, Bridget Williams Books published this book in November last year, Te Hāhi Mihinare, and they told me, you should promote it whenever you're talking. So I'm unashamedly advertising. If it looks like that's what I'm doing, that's because that's what I'm doing. From time to time, during tonight's corridor as well. The book, I was working with John and others. We were working with, as John said, our younger people in the church, particularly in our Māori communities, who face many challenges in our communities. But there was this narrative around the place of Christianity in our history. It's a very valid narrative. It's very challenging around Christianity and its ties to empire colonisation. It's undeniable. It's also being told in a particular way that, again, is very liberating, very powerful, but there's more to it, was one of the challenges. And I trained in history, and I've really come to the understanding that in order for us as a church and as a faith to have something to offer our young people, we needed to renew our narrative. What are our stories that will engage, that tell other parts of that story? And so I went and did my PhD at the University of Auckland. I was very fortunate. I had Dr Harris as one of my supervisors. She's Ngāpuhi, but that's all right. I'm sorry if you're from the north, and sorry to the YouTube people. My wife's from the north, but the odd joke slips out about the north. And I hope I can put it in context to make it sound better later on. So anyway, that's just excusing my northern jokes from time to time. And my other supervisor was Professor James Bennett, who's a very generous and just a fantastic person. So after many years, I was able to do this and working with Bridget Williams, who are amazing publishers. The thing I said to them though, and this cover is just amazing. It's actually designed. It's actually a large. Each of these panels is about 3 meters tall. It was an art design done in an exhibition done in Hamilton. And the designer Neil Partington, he's a fantastic designer, does a lot of New Zealand book covers, said, we were really struggling to find a picture that would cover kind of 200 years of Aotearoa history, which would do justice. And we kept cycling through missionary oil paintings. And I kept smiling and throwing up a little bit in my mouth every time, and like, yeah, this is great. And then when he came up with that, I thought, this is just genius. It's almost, partly it's got a liturgical feel to it. But the weirdest that I said to them was having my name on the front. What is particularly struck me about that is the cordial, and I had the opportunity to write this. I had the time, the skills, I suppose, but the cordial in here is the cordial of many Mihinare from around the country. It's not mine, not mine alone for sure. So to put my name on it was just a bit surreal. It should be, Mihinare, my tipuna, my grandmother, all those people who made up our faith over generations. So there we go, I wrote the book. Tick that box for once. First time tonight. So it was a real, it's been quite a weird journey. The book, again, these things are quite surreal to me. Got longlisted for the Auckland and New Zealand Book Awards a week or so ago. That look at what, when like at the Oscars, when they announce you didn't win, you want to do those facials, like, of course I didn't. There are amazing authors in those awards. I'm not sure which way I'm going. Okay. Oh, this is the very last slide. How do I do that, John? Please don't make me go all the way through. If I can, sorry, John, I'm looking at you like it's your fault anyway.
It's my fault.
But it's John's fault. Just want to make that clear. I want to, tonight's an opportunity to, He Tiriti Mihinare and Anglican Treaty. The double titles got a particular purpose, which I'll kind of get to as we go along, and particularly towards the end of tonight's audible. But John said, can you talk about the treaty? Because we're near Waitangi Day. As I pointed out to John, we're near the northern celebration of the signings of the treaty. The important signings of Te Tiriti Waitangi were, as I'm sure you all know, in May and June 1840, which was the Ngāti Porou signings. If Ngāpui signed them, good for them. And someone had to go first, and someone had to practice and get it wrong. But, good on the rest of it. The Tauranga signings happened in April. Good on the rest of them also. But the important ones were later on in the piece. And this perspective, this iwi perspective of mine about, say, for example, Ngāti Porou, is quite important point forward tonight. So a few things I want to just talk a bit about tonight. One is this idea of mātou and Māori. Another is, and sorry, my writing might be a bit small on the screen. I'll try and read it out as I go. I want to talk a bit about Te Tiriti and its formation, its foundation, and about the Pukehinahina, our Anglican Constitution. But I kind of want to tie broadly together tonight the place of Te Tiriti, the treaty, and Anglicanism, Mihinare, and how those two interrelate, and I think actually genuinely excitingly, the possibilities for the future, not just for our church, but as I think also for Aotearoa, and potentially no pressure for the world. Well, anyone who saw the impeachment stuff over the past few days, the bar's pretty low, so. Mātou. This is a concept. That's a map. Those of you, the screens are a fair way away. It's a map of Oceania, is one terrible name for it. My ancestors left Asia, Southeast Asia, about 6,000 years ago. I'm quite happy with that idea. I'm happy that it's supported by everything from archaeological evidence through to some oral traditions, through to linguistics. If you've ever been to the island of, or if you've heard of the people of the eastern part of the island of Taiwan, I had a friend there who went there near before last. And he said it was quite amazing, particularly on the eastern part of the island, how similar they were to Māori. They had these kind of like longhouses, ancestral houses, where they practiced their hospitality to one another. He said he could have been in a lot of parts of Aotearoa. In particular, one of their communities was all women were the leaders. And they got to a certain point in the proceedings and pulled out the alcohol, and all the men got sent home to look after the children. And the woman provided hospitality. I'm pretty sure that's where my Ngāti Porou for a couple of especially sending the men home. That's very But if you go to parts of Malaysia, again, with Asia, as we tend to do, apart from our tendency to exoticize or orientalize, the Han Chinese influence is, of course, very strong, and over centuries it's developed. But underlying that somewhere is the indigenous influence. I went to the Philippines once. The indigenous Filipino, again, very much like our people in Malaysia. In parts of Malaysia, one of the indigenous words for land is wima. This is our whakapapa. And we began this journey, we set out on this journey across this vast part of the world. It's the biggest part of the world. You can fit Russia in there a few times. It's just immense. We think of it as a sea of islands, and connected to one another through these traditions, through these journeys. And my ancestors that land on an island and that stay there for some time, sometimes many for centuries, but they're always thinking, what's beyond? What's the paipāwhiti? What's beyond that far horizon? And as they continued their journey, they developed and they evolved their philosophy, their science, their theology. their way of being and of knowing evolved through this journey. You don't set out, when they were in perhaps Moke is one of the islands in the Cook Island group. Today, in case you didn't know, today's the anniversary of the killing of Cook in Hawaii. It's being really celebrated on Twitter as a, yeah, we killed Cook. I'm not sure I'll take it quite that far, but but from Moke they have the Pakeha tradition, who's my ancestor. You know, you're sitting in Moke, you're like, from what we can understand, from looking at the water patterns, looking at the migratory patterns of the whales, of the sea life, there's got to be a large body of land somewhere, what we might call southwest of us. So we can work that out enough to leave in enough numbers to go and find that body of land. Now, it's a big issue. If they've been wrong and they've just been guessing, we'd be ill with the penguins now, bouncing around here as a deer. But, you know, they managed in enough numbers, with enough journeys to come. Their science, their philosophy was all well established to make it. But one of the important questions isn't so much that I'm interested in, it's not so much how they did that journey, spectacular journeys as they were, it's more the why. What motivates people to do that, to set out across these vast bodies of water, to do that kind of journey, to undertake these vast distances. This is where this idea of mātou, and then we landed. There are waves of migration. One of them is kind of described as the priests and the kohunga. So the scholars came and established whare wānanga, so places of learning. And where I come from, Ngāti Porou, on the eastern seaboard of the North Island, Kahungunu and Rongowhakaata, there are a series of wānanga established learning places that are centuries old up and down the east coast. Places where we would continue to learn, to explore, to share knowledge. Traditional places of learning for us, ancient bodies of knowledge. Important to think about that. Really important to think about that by the time Europeans started arriving here, we had a really well-established way of thinking about the world. That's the point. We weren't empty vessels waiting to be filled. We had very different ways of thinking about every aspect of the universe that we could understand. This is, I like the term mātou. Mātou means to know, ranga can mean to weave, and mātou ranga is knowledge, probably. But more than just knowledge, I like these definitions. Hirini Kaa, the great Ngāti scholar, talks about it as Māori knowledge complete with its values and attitudes. So not just the how of things, but the why of things as well. Why would you set out on that journey? Why would you do that? What motivates you? What's the philosophy, the theological underpinnings behind your actions? Much more fascinating sometimes than the how. The Waitangi Tribunal talks about mātauranga Māori, not only knowledge, but also the Māori way of knowing. Epistemologies, perhaps, knowledge systems. Te Māori Kaa, the great Ngāti philosopher, who's also, unfortunately, the world's biggest Kiss fan. So you've got to balance those two things out in your head. Sorry, the truth, what has been told. Te Māori Kaa says it's what underpins and gives pointed meaning to Māori knowledge. And what is Māori when it's at home? I'm increasingly resistant to describing myself as Māori. It's a term that has its place in time, its context, but I think we're entering into, we'll come back to this, as we enter into what some call a post-settlement era, and we've got to come up with better terms. Iwi, you know, my Ngāti Porou jokes are not just for effect, that's because that's who I am. Although Māori, of course, growing up in Auckland, had a little context for me. It does. Mātauranga Māori, though, is aligned to and sometimes held in contrast with Mātauranga iwi. So iwi, hapu, and different knowledge systems, different ways of knowing as well. A lot of similarities, a lot of overlaps, but also very big distinctions in there as well. All you need to know for tonight's purposes is the entire 6,000 year journey was so Ngāti Porou could fulfill its purpose. It's a pinnacle of Māori. We're also tremendously humble. We are the most humble Iwi. Again, they're positively Trumpian in our humility. I'm just doing the joke everyone's going to be thinking, if anyone knows us, that's But this is the story I was talking about in terms of what I was encountering as a student at university, as a young student. I'd go into classrooms, and I'm older than I look, it depends really the lighting and stuff, and I'm standing next to John. You've got to, sorry. But I started university in 1990. I'm old enough, I was in Ngāti Walker's amazing class, Introduction to Māori Society, which a generation of Māori went through, and he expanded our way of thinking. It was radical, life-changing stuff, amazing stuff. And this idea of this story of the impact of colonisation on us, was laid out for us in a way that was extremely powerful. We knew lots of the pieces, but ones like Ngāti could bring it together for us in a really amazing way. But in some ways, and again, he was right. And if someone says, what's a book to read on Māori history, I would say Te Hāhi Mihinare by Hirini Kaa. And my second choice would be Ka Whawai Māori, The Struggle with Our Lead by Anglican Church. If you want to read a book on Māori history for a starter, that's the book to read. And yet, there was more. Because as I said, for example, my faith, my whakapapa, my Mihinare, my Christianity, didn't fit into that narrative. In some ways, it was kind of a zero-sum narrative. Christianity, colonisation came, attempted to destroy everything it found. And I was like, this just isn't our experience in Ngāti Porou. Exactly. There's bits of it, but there's more to it than that as well. And lately, hey, there are so few Māori academics, and it takes time for these things to develop. And recently, there have been some really interesting work done by others, particularly by historians, who are just this one. In my stumble. Aloha Harris, who's my supervisor, talks about this idea of cultural change and cultural persistence coexisting. So the arrival of new ideas was not necessarily zero-sum. Yes, colonisation was an attempt to eradicate our culture. Yes, it was. And there was other things happening. It wasn't always just about that. Michael Stevens, another great Ngāti philosopher and historian, he is quite amazing. Talks about the danger of simply equating cultural change with cultural loss. Change isn't always loss. Change can be positive, change can be managed, agency can be a thing. And I'm telling you this, standing on this land, where, the context of colonisation had its full fruit, looking at that window. So, please keep everything in context. It was great, obviously great. It's like, yep, there were times and places we had agency, and then there's stories like this, which tells us the other part of the equation. And Morales, my cousin, who's part Ngāti Porou, part Ngāti, and deals with that really well. Different sectors in the Māori art world renegotiated key concepts of the Māori culture, such as tikanga, tapu, and mana. So again, that sense of negotiation, that we could grapple with some of our really deep ideas in ways that we were had some agency, some power in. And Angela Lara, the great historian, talking about that constant change. We were always evolving as people. We weren't stuck in concrete or in amber. We didn't have this pure culture which never changed since its arrival from many artists. And I'm just going to give you a really quick example of this idea of mātou. For those of you who haven't seen this, this is Tuki's map. So Tuki was a rangatira from the north who was captured, taken to Norfolk Island in the late 18th century, and taken so they could translate to the flax growing weaving industry. And Philip King, who was the governor of New South Wales at the time, said to the Tuki, I want you to draw a map. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's a fascinating little example. So on the left-hand side, we have Cook's map of one of his journeys, what they saw, what they interpreted of their journey. As you can see, it's very similar to what we have today in terms of the topographical map. You can see Rakuara or Stewart Island is not necessarily as connected to the Waipaingamu because they didn't sail in there, whereas Ahuroa, Batch Peninsula is covered. But apart from that, it's very similar. On the right, we have this map drawn by Tuki, who was again from the far north. That's not so much a joke, but I'll take it. I'll take it. What do you, just really quickly, and I know the detail's hard to see, but with Cook's map, any features you notice in particular?
Cook Strait.
Cook Strait, yeah. I think like it'll be Hirini Strait if it was my way. Yeah. But what is he kind of, what are they pointing out? Mountains, yeah. It's hard to see some of the detail.
Relative land mass size.
Yeah, land mass size, yeah. It's kind of, it's geographical, topographical. It's kind of, one way of thinking about it is resources. So, you know, where arable land might be, where the resources, kind of forests, things like forests. Of course, the whole country was heavily forested by and large. But kind of resources, right, as a way of reading. As you travel around the world, this is what the animals you back in London might be interested in. Now, this is Tuki's map, quite fascinating. This is called Pounamu, and it even indicates the existence of a little group of islands down the bottom there. Remember, this is the 1790s, so and travel around out there was harder than under COVID. So Pounamu, and he's calling it Pounamu. So obviously there'd been trade in Pounamu from the South Island right to the far north. He was from the Hokianga on the west coast, right up the top. There's all this. I'm assuming this is Ngāti Porou, you know, the East Cape down here. There'd be dragons, all that kind of, you know, it's fairly blank. But then as you get further north, this harbour in the west there, where do you think that harbour is? What does that represent? Hey? Okay, so it's Hokianga. As you can see, it's quite oversized to the north. Of course it is, you know, that's where he lived his life, that's where his experiences were. It was going to, hey, if I draw a map, it'd be Ngāti Porou and the rest of the line. So of course it's oversized. One thing in particular, and he points out different hapu where they're living. There was a lot of conflict consistently in the north. One thing you won't be able to see though, there's this dotted line running all the way up, kind of winding its way up to the middle, right up to the top. And up the top, there's this little spiky thing. What do you think the little spiky thing is? What is the spiky thing though? Yeah, and there's a thing there. A tree. There's a tree there. And so, what do you think that dotted line is? Yeah, the other way. The spirit, the path that the spirits take as they depart after death. Well, this is in the northern tradition, right? It is actually a point. In Ngāti Porou, for example, our spirits part through our mountain Rikuta. And different, we have different departure points. But here, of course, is saying it's from the north. Interesting, though, how he's seeing the world and how Cook sees the world. And he's seeing this world through Wairua as part of his vision. It's also physical. He's got some major landmarks. Just a very different way of seeing things coming from very different spaces. And into all this context lands Christianity. Oh, look at Edward. You won't believe how it is. Anyway, down in the tree. So, we're going to talk a bit about Te Tiriti, the treaty. When I first went to university, they got me to teach a course called Waitangi Treaty Tribunal. And I was with all these, we don't have any mature students at the university anymore. Our national government fee structure made sure of that. So I asked this room full of 19, 20-year-olds, how many of you have studied the treaty before at school? And probably 80% of them put their hand up. And probably half the class had studied it for 10 years or more at school. This is this new generation of New Zealanders, right? The problem was, they were heartily sick of it by the time they got to university. It was a kind of exhaustion. And so, look, there's worse forms of exhaustion. And there's, it's really important for them to know. But it was really interesting to me that they studied it over and over and over. Also, in some respects, amazing young people as they were, kind of how little they knew in some respects. Partly they were still circling around the same resources over and over. Because teachers, go teach this. What am I going to teach it with? Well, there's like the book, use that book. And the next teacher uses this. But it was fascinating also, the potential was untapped, we'll put it that way. So I was a little bit, when John invited me to come and talk and type to Tiriti, the treaty tonight, great. But I hope you're not treaty exhausted, and hopefully we've got some slightly different ways of thinking about it as well. So I'm going to talk about Europe, just like change the pace. Because it's important to think about these transnational ties, and context is important, where these ideas are coming from. And in some ways, and the way I often like to think about this is about ideas, as much as about actions and outcomes. That's what underpins it all. The martyrdom. So the martyrdom coming from Europe is important to me, the way I think about this. Hopefully you'll know, or reasonably familiar with, the development of European Christianity, particularly going into at the end of the 18th and early 19th centuries. The development of the evangelical movements, and we've got the Methodists to blame for that, by and large. The Industrial Revolution, always fascinating, for example, how the influence of the Industrial Revolution on gender in England. The ideas of women staying at home and gendering the household, is as much a product of the industrial economy as of any great, ideological ideas about gender. Where these ideas come from, and also, consequently, in some ways, recent developments. So the idea that Pākehā came and imposed their ideas of gender on us, yes, and those ideas of gender, they were changing too, a lot. But let's talk about our slave trade. So obviously the slave trade was resisted, in England in particular, by a group of Christians, and most famously William Wilberforce and the Clapham. Really important, also a fascinating and I think quite beautiful, powerful story in some ways. Also quite disappointing in the detail. Don't look too deep. Look just deep enough to feel enthusiastic and then look away. A lot of history could be like that, unfortunately. But there was a strong Christian push to resist the slave trade. First, the abolition of the slave trade itself, then of course of slavery in whole. By 1834, I think they banned across the empire. The slaves, though, the British Navy were rescuing in between Africa and North America in particular, they were then basically put back into a better form of slavery kind of contracts. So, again, but it was a significant development. And it took a huge amount of energy. And again, if you follow the story, amazing use of energy, use of social justice, always makes me disappointed in our Anglican Church when we're not doing enough, because we kind of know what we're capable of when we get our act together. You can't be strong faith and powerful ideas of social justice. So they put all this energy into abolishing the slave trade. I know we had someone recently come to talk about the Church Missionary Society, but I still think worth talking about a little bit in this context as well. A voluntary religious organisation tied very closely to the evolution of empire. And remember, empire was one thing. It was the extraction and exploitation of resources from others for the growing wealth and benefit of Britain. That's all the empire was. And it's hard. It was a giant money-making machine. But alongside this, and you have the missionary societies evolve, including the Church Missionary Society, essentially the Anglican outreach. And it was tied to the abolition of slavery, and in some ways seen as an atonement for slavery as well. And of course, we've got Samuel Marsden coming out in 1814, Henry Williams, 1823, and others coming as well. I know you had someone talk to you about this. But I like this little idea by Richard Strong. The empire was a divine providence, a gift from God. It was an Anglican political community for which the CMS had the religious and moral responsibility. So they saw the empire as a gift from God, and their role was to uphold the religious and moral responsibility. This guy, Henry Venn. I'm a big fanboy of Henry Venn. Henry Venn, as you can see, was honorary secretary to the Church Missionary Society for about 30 years, 1841 to 1873. So during a very influential time in the CMS's work around the world. Henry Venn Henry Venn's father worked alongside William Wilberforce in establishing the Clapham settlement. So Henry Venn was tied in very heavily to the politics, to the social justice of the Clapham settlement, to some of the strong ideas of theology that underpinned them. And Henry Venn, honorary secretary. So back in England, he was basically running the show, doing the fundraising, running the organisation, while the CMS missionaries were doing the work around the empire. So he was influential in that he was at the head office, he was tied into British power circles, English power circles in particular. He was influential in that he was at the head, again at the centre, but limited in terms of his authority. He couldn't necessarily control, because communications being what they were and missionaries doing what they did. Here's one of Henry Venn's ideas that I particularly love. He said that the people that the CMS encountered should remain native in all respects, except in this that they become Christian. Christianity not denationalising them, but in them becoming naturalised. And he talked about this idea of the euthanasia of mission. He particularly opposed the idea of missionary societies like the CMS. He opposed the idea of churches. He worked hard against Selwood, establishing dioceses here. He didn't want a permanent European, British, English presence around the empire in terms of church. He opposed that. When Samuel Marsden came to Aotearoa in 1814, do you know the two people he brought with him? The two men? Kendall in 1840, yeah. Who came with him? The two tradesmen in particular, though. Do you know what they did? A shoemaker and a rope maker. Okay. Now, you're coming to Ohi in 1814. You can see the purpose of ropes. Look, of course, they were pretty generally minded, they could survive, they could do a range of things, right? But I love the metaphor. Why would you bring a shoemaker? Hey? Because you have a lot of walking to do. Sure, absolutely. Absolutely. You want to replace your own shoes. But, what's another reason you bring a shoemaker? For your own shoes. What might you be saying to Māori? You should be wearing shoes. I just love the idea as a kind of image. Now, Marsden was very clear about this too, right, in his writings. He called it the arts, but he tied European, British civilization to Christianity. He said the way to get the message across is through our technological, philosophical, overwhelming might superiority. This is how we're going to succeed with the Māori in the north and around the country. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to tie being Christian to being like us. They're going to look like us, they're going to talk like us, they're literally going to walk like us. Because Māori had lasted hundreds of years without shoes, getting around this water, well, particularly English shoes, which always are particularly uncomfortable. But that relationship, right? And this is again what I've been taught as an undergrad student. Christianity was tied explicitly to technology, to ideology, to philosophy. All these things needed to be in the exchange. Then, though, he's saying something else entirely. He's saying, actually, what they've got is fine. Let's not mess with them. Let's just bring our message and let's let it work with them. Now, obviously, there's some blurring of lines there, right? Obviously, sometimes it's hard to tell where one finish is going to begin. But I just want you to think about that. And it was also, this is quite tripping, this was happening around the world at the time. They were saying, actually, let's not mess with these cultures too much as we go out around the world. Let's just take our message, sow the seed, let it grow. Now, in particular, think about context, they're talking about places like China and India, where the numbers were just overwhelming. They were taking control of the world anyway. But same in Aotearoa in 1814 or 1840. There is no way they could foresee, we can run that place soon enough. Not, especially not with my Ngāpuhi in-laws standing there in the way. I'll talk really briefly about the whakaputanga, the declaration. This is where I get particularly heretical. Whakaputanga, apart from anything, was signed by my wife's great-great-great-grandfather, who was also a secretary to Te Tiriti. So I had a connection there. Whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence, was signed 1845. It was signed mainly in the north. The reason I can't completely dismiss it is because it was also signed by my Kahungunu ancestor, Hāpuku, and the Whero from Waikato signed it. But I think an important point with the declaration was, again, it was mainly in the north. A lot of this history we're talking about was mainly in the north. And there were some exceptions, like Porou. Why do you think a lot of this history we're talking about took place in the north? Why do you think we understand or emphasize the northern story so much? Any ideas? Most of the people. I think Māori were pretty well spread out around the country. Yes, most of the Europeans were living in the north. And the visitors came to the north. So Russell is the hellhole of the Pacific, which is, I won't even follow that joke up. But most of the Europeans were living in the north. So why do we know these northern stories so well? I want to make a bit of a jump here. Because they wrote home to England. Yeah, sure, okay. So writing back to home. What were they writing back home? What it was like, and just follow that up. But what kind of things were they saying? What did they have a purpose? Was it like, hey, cuz, it's going well here, or what were a lot of those letters about? Do you know?
Probably were giving their interpretation of what the information people know.
Sure, they're giving the interpretation, sure. And a lot of it was fundraising, right, as well. Like, please send us money. Like, things are going so well here, and look, they needed the money, so, let's not quibble. It was just like, things are going fantastically, please send money. To keep us going, and, completely understandable. But we've still got a couple of steps to go. So they were sending all these letters back to England, Ireland, and these letters went where? To like mission societies, to friends, to fundraisers, to people. Where are those letters now? Yeah, they're in archives all over England. I was in England researching a few years ago. Just amazing. Like I was completely unprepared for the scale of English archives, right? I'm used to going down to Turnbull in Wellington. Amazing what they are cheaper on it. But in England, in the archive, you enter in the computer, it's like, would you like to start with 1500, 1600, or 1600 to end with, millions and millions of pieces of writing? It was just like, I was like, oh, you people. And the computer system wasn't good as ours. But these letters, right, and the CMS collection, for example, is up at the University of Bennett. And these letters sat there for a long time, and then who picked these letters up? That's right, historians. Dun, dun, dun. And then they said, right, so this is what was happening, and then they write the books or the journal articles, and that makes its way into the bloodstream, and that's how we understand the story we've got today. That's why the emphasis on the north, because the European missionaries are writing in the north, and they're writing, and this is a really important part. What language were the missionaries writing in? What language were Māori writing in? Te reo Māori. They were writing pretty much as soon as they could. By the 1840s, you get a big stack of letters start appearing amongst Māori. But in te reo. Very, very few writing English. And one last question. Could historians read te reo Māori? Okay. I'll just leave that there for a little bit. Okay. I'll let you sit up and think about that. So, whose story gets told? Why does it get told? What's the process? And how do we know what we know? Because the process is like this. It's almost accidental, right? Or depressingly prosaic. But the whakaputanga comes out, it is really important, particularly in the north. It's the rangatira of the north saying, and there's some really important ideas coming out in there around their own assertion of mana wotaki, their own autonomy coming through. There's also a sense of collective identity for amongst the first time. We need to be collective because these outside forces are coming. The idea of us being Māori, well, there's a new idea to us, because previously we've all been very much in our own identity. We didn't need to be Māori until Pakeha. And it's described, whakaputanga, and the Waitangi Tribunal's done a lot of work on its importance in terms of preparing the ground, and what it says in itself, in its own right as well. Okay, I'll talk about this Māori right. Lord Normanby was the Secretary of State for the colonies, so he ran the office in London in 1839. He was very flashy. You see his picture, he looks like a vampire, if you ask me. And he was in charge of basically policy, all policy around the colonies in 1839, 1840. He gave, so when they went to develop a treaty for this land, the Colonial Office developed some instructions that would guide the formation of that treaty. Okay, they didn't just make it up when they got it. I'm sorry, if you know this, by just trying to get it across quite quickly. And so these instructions, Lord Normanby's instructions as they're called, are very influential. To understand them in some ways is to understand the intentions of the treaty. You know, beyond the straight wording of the treaty itself. What were they trying to achieve with this treaty? Well, what were the instructions in the first place? It's going to make sense, right? But these instructions weren't actually written by Lord Normanby because he was busy being of empire. They were written by Sir James Stephen, who was a very influential civil servant in the office. He basically ran policy during this time. He was Under Secretary of State for the colonies during this time. James Stephen's father was also one of the founding members of the Clapham sect. James Stephens was very strongly influenced, and there's a lot of evidence around this, very strongly influenced by the theology and the philosophies that were driving the Clapham sect and driven the anti-slavery movement. So he was strongly influenced by that, right? And he was in charge of the policy of the instructions. So, and their policy process was, you know, he said this is what's going to be in it. There was some discussion, but it's pretty much what was going to be in it. The right person at the right place at the right time. Just by comparison, and comparisons are absolutely terrible in this corridor. I will do it anyway. When did the first fleet, I think they call it, arrive in Australia? 1 minute? Yeah, I don't know. It was a bad day, let's put it that way. 1790s, put it somewhere around there. I was walking through Sydney, in downtown Sydney, and I came across this little block of concrete. And it's like, here landed the first fleet of arrivals to establish the colony of New South Wales. It's like, ooh. And then just this little weird block of concrete in the middle of a footpath in Sydney somewhere. The difference, though, is very instructive. The abolition movement, at the same time, was making no traction whatsoever. In fact, they were basically pariahs in English society because they were getting in the way of the money. The people in charge of the policy in England at the time had none of this kind of thinking. And look at their policy in Australia. Anyone know the Latin term they use in Australia, really? Terra nullius, which meant the vacant land. So, just compare and contrast, right? If this had happened, 40 years earlier, it would have been a terra nullius policy. But instead, we got these weird Christians at the right place at the right time doing the right thing. And if it was 40 years later, it would have been bad times again. History isn't progressive, right? Donald Trump's gone until the next one comes. Trust me, history is not, we're not getting better every time. We're just on the cycles. And this history is good, present today. So, and in particular, this guy, Ned Fletcher, I use his work. He wrote his thesis, finished in 2014. Now, Ned Fletcher is the son of, I'm about to forget her name again, she was our last Chief Justice. Charles, and his father's Hugh Fletcher, and he wrote this amazing thesis, like 1,000 pages long, apart from anything, but it's all the regulations and just kind of right. It is quite amazing though, in that he does a lot of thinking about the formation of the treaty that hadn't been done before. Thing to think there, you want to know who Ruth Ross was? Ruth Ross was an amazing woman who was doing her Masters in History at the University of Auckland. And in 1972, she published an article about the signing of the treaty. And all the men at the university said, "Oh, what are you coming that nonsense for?" And she said, "Because it's important, shut up." And she published it, and they're like, "Wow, this is actually pretty amazing." She very sadly got terminal cancer and passed on her work and her legacy to another woman, Claudia Orange, who took up that work as well. And so these amazing popular women against all advice and all career possibilities, took up amongst the Pākehā world this narrative around the treaty. And included Orange's book, which has just been reissued by Bridget Lee's books, who's also published an amazing they published Claudia's book. But you know, it came out in 1987, the Treaty of Waitangi. But Claudia never says, and it wasn't definitive. We're still learning. You know, our research, our thinking about the treaty didn't stop, and now we're just sharing it. Right? We're still learning new things, particularly now iwi perspectives on it. You know, I've been telling you about the signing, the only important signing was in the Waipuru on the 1st of June. Well, actually, I can back that up if you want me to, you know, from my perspective. So again, you know, we're still learning about these things. Let's not say stop. And now Nick Fletcher is in charge of the prosecution service and much talking about mining. Anyway, so the writers, Busby, I like this, I wrote this, but it's also still, makes me giggle, was egotistical and wanted to follow up as what he saw as his magnum opus with the Declaration. Hobson, anyone know what date Hobson arrived? Initials? Yeah, like 31st of January. Just quite important is to say, just turns up in his boat 31st of January with these instructions, basically from James Stephens, to sign the treaty. So, you know, they worked pretty quick, these guys. Busby was sitting there, basically Busby got pushed out by Hobson. And there's all this is happening up north, James Stephen again. Now, here's some of the really important ideas in these instructions, underpinning these instructions. Some of this comes from Ned Fletcher's thesis. Māori possess political and property rights that could be modified only by agreement. Okay, so Māori had political and property rights. Remember in Australia, 40 years earlier, that idea didn't exist. These people have nothing, they are nothing. We're just going to say they're not here, basically. We're going to treat them until 1972 like flora and fauna, like animals and plants. Whereas here they said, those people have political and property rights. What do political and property rights imply? To have, what do you need to have political and property rights? Ownership? Yeah, well, yeah, you got ownership. If I've got political rights or property rights, yeah, ownership. And what does ownership imply? If I say I own that piece of carpet, what does that? You can have it back later, but what does it mean? Yeah, structure. I've got my own social structure. You will understand I own it. John may, you know, but anyway, yes, I own now, John. So majority of it. I'm going to take that carpet with me out. Okay. It implies a whole bunch of things, right? Around social structure. And I would say it implies marketing, the recognition of marketing. I'm going to use retrospectively and that too. And remember, this is kind of Ben's thinking too. Those people are fine. They've got everything they need. We just need to introduce Christianity. Or in this case, we need to introduce, and these instructions be tolerant of custom. You do not claim any right to impose British culture on Māori. And they were doing this all across the empire at the time. These type of treaties that recognise culture. Māori. So this intervention was, and this is Ned Fletcher's ideas, was to establish a government over British settlers. They would get the sovereignty from Māori to establish government over settlers, and in order to protect Māori. They'd use the energy coming from the anti-slavery movement. The Aboriginal Protection Society was springing up, weirdly alongside the RSPCA at the time. But you know, actually, I know. To be honest, I used to hate the SPCA. I know it was sort of weird mission, but you know, I was always more hard primary. Everyone loved the SPCA, but wouldn't do human stuff. Anyway. But if you think about it, the empire was exploiting all of nature. You know, and animals were suffering needlessly, you know, and so were people. It was just a terrible, terrible situation. You know, and some of these British people say, well, some of these Christians will say, actually, why are we doing this to like horses and stuff as well? I know, weird argument, but you can see the kind of energy that was flowing, right? And Ned Fletcher's last point, the colonial office didn't foresee the widespread and rapid colonisation that was to come. In 1840, anyone know how many Māori were living in Aotearoa? Estimates about 100,000. And remember, quite heavily armed. Actually, very heavily armed. We've been waging war, or Ngāti have been waging war on the rest of us for about 20 years since then. You know, well, that's a thing. Like, not just armed, but very experienced at fighting, right? And the British are like, man, we're not going near that. You know, like, they know they would have taken a huge military force and done anything. I'm not, you know, just saying, this is a reasonable argument, perhaps. They didn't say it was a long way away. Okay, I'm just going to go real quick, sorry, through the text. For those of you who don't know, and there's much more to it. I'll go into Article 1. So, I don't do the Treaty Tiriti thing, because I love the Waitangi Tribunal. Oh, I should get a big thing, I love the Tribunal, like a family week. Partly because Aroha Harris is on there and I'm terrified of her, because she's on that. But also, they've done some amazing work, which I'm going to come back to. But also, reconciling the treaty into Tiriti is one of their jobs. And I'm going to try and make this really impossible point towards the end of what that might imply. So, on Bara, you know, in the treaty in the English version, Māori see absolute reservation, the rights, powers, and sovereignty, and in Te Reo, ceded kāwanatanga. And the differences are immense. Kāwanatanga, to be honest, wasn't even really a thing. You know, the closest would be Pontius Pilate as governor. You know, like, what's a governor when he's New South Wales? Well, yeah, but that's very limited. We've seen that, that's not much. You know, they weren't giving up a lot. They certainly weren't giving up some ideas of sovereignty. But Ned Fletcher has done several hundred pages on this idea of sovereignty and what the colonial office meant by that. And he said it's not talking about this idea of absolute power in all spheres. Certainly not the way it's exercised by Parliament in New Zealand at the moment. He's saying it's mainly referring to things like foreign affairs and power over sectors. That's what was meant by sovereignty during the drafting and assignment. Tricky idea, but we can still keep thinking about these things. Article 2, tino rangatiratanga will be retained as opposed to full exclusive unreserved. And neither of those obviously were held up entirely. And I'm going to tell you something just full of heresy tonight. There's an influential Ngāti Porou leader, I can't even name, who said to me once, this term tino rangatiratanga, it's a stupid word made up by some missionary. His point was quite correct. You know when Henry Williams was given the treaty to translate? Yeah, you know what time roughly? They mark it like 5 p.m. or something. 4 p.m. I think it was. And here, translate this tonight. There's some quite complex ideas. Good luck. He wasn't even the good linguist. William Williams was the good one, but he was away. So they gave it to the one who was bad at the language to translate the idea of sovereignty. And he came up with what is actually quite stupid too, of tino rangatiratanga, the absolute practice of being a chief. Like, it's not the best. What my Ngāti Porou source, who will not be revealed through the cameras, I promise. The idea of mana also, really the idea of mana was much more central. Tino rangatiratanga was a makeshift idea. And the rights and privileges are relatively similar in my and without getting into too much. So we're going to break very shortly, but I told you I'm Ngāti Porou, just one stop. I'll be here tomorrow morning, we'll still be going. I'll be joke, you should just have a little clicker for every joke I make about the North and just keep clicking away. So you run out of clicks. I married into the north. I didn't choose to be born Ngāti Porou. I didn't choose that one, but I did choose to marry into the north. I just want to make that statement. Okay, so the colonial office, so you make your life choices and you live within them. The colonial office assumed property rights. Māori had property rights, capable of being alienated. A full undisputed possession implied that, for sure. Māori tribal government and custom would be maintained. Mātai, surely nothing says a knowledge system more than a social structure. How else do you interact with one another, using ideas of papa and mana to manage those relationships between people, between hapu, whānau, iwi. The federal arrangements would carry on in some respects, and this is Fletcher's ideas of sovereignty would be defined and limited around foreign relations, justice, peace, and good order, and trade, not all spheres of life as it ended up being. And this is one of Fletcher's really important points. British sovereignty wasn't seen as inconsistent with plurality of government law. So you can have multiple spheres of sovereignty in the overlapping. It wasn't like it's our sovereignty or no one. It was like you can have Māori sovereignty, whatever it looked like, and Crown sovereignty overlapping in the same space. This is Fletcher's definition of sovereignty from him looking at the colonial office. Whether that helps us today or not, we'll kind of circle back. Really important though, a couple of views. The New Zealand company was sending the ship Tory, 1839. They were going to land at Wellington with a shipload of migrants because they wanted to force the pace. They wanted to force the annexation of this land, and so the colonial office kind of had its hand forced as well. We have to get ready for these migrants arriving. Ngāpuhi, according to the Waikato, their claim at the tribunal, said they had one idea on economic considerations and on resources. Why else? They didn't have the sign. Militarily, they're immensely strong. They had everything in their own hands. They chose to sign. The tribunal said that Crown always had odd circumstances, but circumstances forced their hand. And Richard Hill, the Pākehā historian, says, don't be naive. It was just the cheapest way to get it home. I think he's right. I think in some ways they're all kind of right. That's what what is it? A hospitality of marriages, as the Irish president wrote recently. You know, we can have many of these things happening. They don't necessarily cancel each other out. We just need to understand what they're all saying to us. The most important signing, as I said, bottom right hand corner, signed by Dakota Ukarani. He's my father's namesake. My father is named after Dakota Ukarani at Treaty Cemetery. Because in Ngāti Porou we kept that narrative alive. We didn't have to wait for Ruth Ross and Claudia Orange to bring it back to us. And I'll just finish this section by talking about something you know all too well here. 1860 to 1881 broadly, you would count 1840s of the New Zealand Wars. I've got a picture of Parihaka because in the Waitangi Tribunal Taranaki report, they say it was the end of a 21-year campaign in Taranaki of terror. They used the terms genocide and Holocaust in relation to the war in Taranaki. Why I think we should think about those terms, challenging as they are, is the people of Taranaki, again, were subjected to 21 years of terror from both formal and informal troops. You know, not many people know that. Everyone thinks, oh, the war's finished in 1865 when Waikato, were defeated. But in Taranaki, the war raged on and on and on. It's Afghanistan, just right here. And the campaign of terror, my Pākehā uncle grew up loving Gustav von Timsky. He was cool, I had comics with him, he had these little pistols and flick out of his thing. My uncle was a Pākehā New Zealander, grew up with these narratives. But von Timsky was part of this terror campaign waged in Taranaki, where they would kill innocent people, keep terror going. And the rape of Parihaka was the end of that particular era. And just to finish on a really good note, upbeat note, James Prendergast, the Chief Justice, said in 1877 that the Treaty of Waitangi was worthless because it had been signed between a civilized nation and a group of savages, and paraphrasing, were not capable of signing a treaty. Since the treaty had not been incorporated, domestic law was a civil malady. So Prendergast, the lead of the judiciary in 1877, 40 years later, is taking James Stephens and Henry Venn and the Clapham sex ideas of the integrity, perhaps, the value of mātauranga, and flushing it straight away. So we couldn't have signed a treaty with them. They had no social structure. They had no property rights. There was nothing there to sign them. Just think about the cycles of history. 40 years later, this is where New Zealand had got to. And well, I believe you heard recently the consequences for those people. So I'll just have a break there. Sorry, John. And we're going to talk about the future of the treaty after the break. But you're happy to leave because I'll just look to myself.
So just a couple of notices. The first is I forgot to say thank you to TET for giving us the money to buy our air conditioning units. And there should be a thing up there, so I'll put it up at the break. And the second thing is there is cold water available through in the lounge. So you've got about 5 minutes to just stretch, give your bottom a break, and then we'll start again. And he eventually went, if we could all just stop looking out the window and worrying about what's happening out the window, let's just focus on what's happening in this room, and then when this is finished, we can look out the window and worry about whether we're going to go home. You're not quite that bad, but for now, let's not worry about what's happening outside, let's just enjoy what we're doing here, and we worry about what's going to happen at midnight after we leave this place. So, I invite you to carry on with your kōrero.
Yes. That is the most Anglican story I've ever heard. I was in the quarters of the British ones. Sorry. The fog was a metaphor for a church. We don't know where we're going. Okay, we're going to talk about the future a little bit. It's not. Yes, sorry, that was exciting. We can't fix it in the next half hour, so we'll fix the treaty in the country instead. It's going to be fun. That's why I was telling you some argument, but that's fine. Probably helps to be fine. So 1877, Prendergast, and that's a marker. And of course, history didn't stop there. Other developments occurred around the treaties in Tiriti. over time, and Māori protest was continuous. Māori attempted to keep the treaty alive. Ngāti Porou had the most amazing story of Pukehinahina. A lot of Kiwi. That phone has really got a sense of urgency. The phone's like, tell this guy to shut up. Isn't it? It's like pointing about upcoming numbers. Okay. And you can't stop it, can you? Luckily. If anyone gets a different message, if you let us know, that'd be quite handy. So Māori protest, Māori energy around the treaty continued. Like I said, my father's was named, and he was born in 1941, and he was named after a treaty signature. We kept our narrative alive, but historians started doing a lot of important work with Ross, Willie Orange, Judith Bennett, Keith Sorensen, James Welch, amongst others, Keith Sinclair, of course. Historians, I think it just, part of history, of course, but incredibly important, I think, transformative. It's about our narratives, right? I don't know how many of us here might call ourselves Christians, but the importance of having, for example, a creation narrative that says why we're here and what we're supposed to do about that is incredibly important. I can't imagine not having one. I actually have several. When you move up to the various versions of Genesis through to the Big Bang, and I'm happy to live with all of them and what they say to me. So, having those narratives are incredibly important. And those narratives get rewritten. When William Pender Reeves in the 1890s, through to Keith Sinclair in the 1950s, telling us that we're this egalitarian, Pavlova paradise, number 8 wire, she'll be right, kindness. When Jacinda Ardern uses the term kindness, she's kind of pulling on this historical narrative. It's not coming out of nowhere, this idea that we're kind. It's coming from our sense of who we are. Whether that's true or not is a whole other question. But it's powerful. Look at Donald Trump, make America great again. Extremely powerful call to history. The history doesn't have to be true. It's just a call to it. And it's worked extremely well for him to a point. So, this idea, that things were wonderful back in the day. Just ask African Americans, Native Americans, how great things were. And so for us, this importance of history in terms of our narrative, in terms of who we are, what we're supposed to do, why we're supposed to do it. Social transformation of the 1980s, 70s and 80s, everything from fourth-wave feminism to anti-nuclear movement, anti-apartheid. I'm sure many of you here were involved or engaged in that in various ways. And then lawyers. Lawyers come along and kill the wounded on the battlefield and then charge them for them. Sorry, any lawyers here? Sorry. Lawyers come to make all the money off the back of all this work. That's great. Actually, lawyers do the detail. There's some amazing members of some amazing lawyers here. Dave Williams here not long ago, right? Dotting the I's and crossing the T's, this transformation. But the historians just say, minimal money, just say. Okay. Again, I use the example of Western Point. I work at the University of Auckland. In Auckland, you can see all the arcade from the city. It was quite an amazing impact. The occupation of Whakaparao, because it was in Auckland's face. It wasn't some distant golf course or ancestral land of the Wamps. It was right in the middle of Auckland, hard to avoid and ignore. Transformative and incredibly painful for Ngāti Porou, of course. Tautotiki Rangowhakaata, incredibly important in this ongoing journey of He Tiriti. He had his vision, the Holy Spirit descending upon him, began his healing ministry in 1918. Very, very conservative, nowadays you call him an evangelical, with a healing ministry and a great media presence. He would have killed Twitter if he'd been on it, or YouTube at the time. And the queues, the 5 kilometre queues lining up from the train station to his house for him to help him. And, you know, New Testament or bust with until he engaged more openly with the mātara of his people and said, Te Tiriti or Waitangi is a thing for us. And he took the Bible in his right hand and Te Tiriti or Waitangi in his left hand and said, these things go together. He did what Māori have been doing constantly, challenging the powerful, speaking on behalf of the marginalised. And so the result, the Pākehā bishops excommunicated him and his followers. When they were excommunicated in 1925, there were tens of thousands who moved across to follow Rātana, but they were still Anglican and Catholic and Methodist. They just happened to follow this healer, you know, just like Anglicans might go along to, you know, listen to a particular preacher or something, another church. You can do both. Well, I can't, others can do it. Such an Anglican. His followers got excommunicated by reading, and there's a book that covers that. Partly because, you know, that's not rocket science. The Pākehā bishops loved him when he was a faith healer who they thought was going to stamp out tohunga, which they thought meant mātara, which actually he meant charlatans and people exploiting the Billy TKs of the world, was what he meant. And so they excommunicated him and his followers because he was too political, and they issued instructions which got translated into Te Reo Māori, including instructions to Māori clergy. If you bury an Rātana adherent, you must treat them like they're a suicide. Very limited. You can't use the Book of Common Prayer. You've got to bury your children quickly if you're going to do it at all. It's just terrible. Our community's got divided. My wife comes from a place called Te Pātū in the far north, just north of Kaiārahi, south of Kaiārahi. In their urupa, their cemetery, they have a fence running along the middle of it, which I always thought was really weird. And their uncle died, and I was helping to conduct the funeral service. We get to the gate, and they start having this big argument. They got the uncle up on their shoulders, and on that side was the Rātana side, and that side was the Anglican Mihinare side. And they dug a hole in both sides. And they argued, but he was born Rātana, yeah, but we brought him up and we're doing the burial. They had this big shouting match. It was, you know, part of me was entertaining, but part of me was horrifying. And this was the result of the Pākehā bishops excommunicating the followers and divided communities. And overnight, tens of thousands of Māori got divided overnight by this arbitrary action from the Pākehā bishops. It didn't go down too well in the Māori world, as you can imagine, because Rātana was offering this amazing vision. And his followers saw it through. 1943, Eastern Māori was the last set to fall to the Māori Hutu, the Rātana movement. They took Ngāti's seat off it. They remained in power until 1993. 50 years that prophetic movement held those 4 seats in Parliament. If you didn't know that, well, you should know that. Until they got taken out by their next great prophet, Winston Peters. I am in his home, you know, you're beginning. And their great triumph was Matirata, who was Ngāti Porou, and one of their ministers, who got the Waitangi Tribunal established in 1975. They were relentless in their pursuit of Te Tiriti. And it was tied inherently to their faith. This is how they saw their faith as being expressed in being manifested in Te Tiriti. Beautiful, beautiful vision, and came to fruition. We should give thanks. Meanwhile, the Anglican world, we were losing market share that way. And the Pākehā bishops didn't like that. So the demands of Māori to have a Māori bishop were pushed relentlessly, led by Pukehinahina, the great lay leader of Te Hāhi Mihinare. The fight which again is covered quite extensively in the book, but it's very instructive. The Pākehā bishops said, essentially in 1925, they set up everything that was required for a Māori bishop. There was a diocese. The diocese of Yokotama Aotearoa covered the grounds of Te Tiriti College. That was the entire diocese. But they gave it all the trusts and all the monies from around Aotearoa. So it was going to be relatively wealthy. It would have its own bishop, its own delegation to General Synod, which was really important. That bishop would be fully empowered to ordain clergy, to do everything a Pākehā bishop could do, on one condition, that the first bishop had to be a Pākehā. The Pākehā bishops absolutely insisted on that point. They said no Māori were experienced or qualified, even though Māori had been clergy since 1854 at Pukehinahina. They even said you can have a Pākehā who speaks Te Reo Māori, and there was a lot of division within Te Ao Māori, within the Māori world about this. But Apirana Ngata basically stood firm. He was the Minister of Māori Development in 1928. And he stood at General Synod and persuaded them that we would have a Māori to be the first bishop. Did it pretty much single-handedly. Ngata was just amazing. If you could get a chance to read over his biography of him. But he also, this was a test for Māori of this idea of mātauranga. You know, but why do you want this Pākehā who speaks Te Reo Māori? No, because they don't think like us. They don't have our ngākau, our kind of basic emotions, soul, heart. They don't think the way we need them to think. This is in 1925. In case anyone's thinking this is like a relevant recent development. The first calls for a Māori bishop were in the first recorded call was in 1880. We've been entirely consistent through our entire history of the need for our mātauranga to be at its forefront. It wasn't necessarily about ethnicity. It was about, and Ngata was very clear about this, it was the way people saw the world. And he had various ways of describing that. But only a Māori could do the role. The Williams family, the descendants of Henry and Williams, said that if a Māori was put in the role, they would withdraw their funding, which they did. And the Bishop of Aotearoa in 1928 was funded by the Ngāti Porou Dairy Company and by the Tarawa Trust Board for the first several years. So the iwi put their money where their mouths were after they got what they thought they needed and paid for this role in what was then the Great Depression. And Māori, of course, suffered much more than Pākehā in the Great Depression economically because we had no land base to survive from. And we often were eligible or were less eligible for benefits even when those came in. So, Ngata, this photo I love, even though it's very sad. This is Fred Bennett, who was the first Bishop of Aotearoa. He was from Tarawa. He led the fight against Ngata. He was basically working with the Pākehā bishops, trying to get a Pākehā in the role of the first bishop. Apirana Ngata had this great quote, which I'm only going to quote. I'm not going to enjoy quoting, but I'll just quote it objectively. Apirana Ngata said Bennett suffered from the terrible weakness of succumbing to Pākehā flattery. I don't know what he meant by that, but I'll just saying. And he said if the demand's not met, there'll be ructions in the church. And then he said, the Bishop of Aotearoa, this is Apirana Ngata's tangi. That's his body line there behind them. You can see those two men standing up the back. One is John Tapahori Sr., who is my great uncle. Next to him is Dan Kaa, who's my grandfather's brother. On the far right is, far left, sorry, is Pukehinahina Kohere. He was our priest at Anglicans in our village for 50 years, from 1904 to 1954. And he was blind by then, but he memorised the entire prayer, so it didn't matter. So these are some of the clergy farewell and right there. That's coming. The Anglican Church, though, this may not surprise you, has been declining in numbers for quite some time. this goes up to 2006, obviously. Obviously, the total numbers keep climbing. Quite important to think, in 1918, there were essentially zero Rātana adherents, because Rātana had a division in November 1918 that the Holy Spirit descended upon him. Within 8 years, 12,000 Māori were adherents of his which obviously increased over time. But then you have the proportion of the total Māori population as opposed to numbers. We now are both managing to fall in total numbers and in proportion. And look at that bottom line. 1981, 55,000 Māori objected to or said they had no religion. 2006, 240,000. And that number's grown exponentially across Pākehā and Māori in New Zealand. In the 1970s and 80s, for a range of reasons, including aligned with these activist movements I talked about earlier, and in the church in particular, ideas of liberation theology, combined with the Māori Renaissance, is a very potent mix. Ranginui Walker and his scholarship combined with, some amazing, combined with Vine Deloria writing Custard Died for Your Sins, an Indigenous manifesto for theology, for example, was powerful stuff for Māori in the 1970s, 1980s. And this was this confluence of both social activism within the church, worldwide trends, Vatican II, a whole bunch of things coming together at this time in the mid-1980s. This is a quote by Paul Reeves, who then was the Bishop of Auckland after translating from Waiaka. The Anglican Church, I think he was, I'm going to say Archbishop, 1983. Anyone know? But he was the first Māori to be Archbishop as well, around this time. This is a quote: "The Anglican Church has a responsibility to ensure that the treaty, which was actively supported in 1840, can still be a basis for social contract or living partnership today. Cannot avoid facing the fact that presently there is an uncomfortable uncertainty over the future of this partnership." Paul Reeves was being influenced by a range of ideas and people. The Māori Anglican Church, our standing committee, Runanga Whaiti, was stopped with the leadership of the Māori world, just like it had been in the 1920s. We had everyone from Ngāti Porou to Whaihuri and Roroi to Te Hāhi Jury, who was the chief judge of the Māori Land Court and, of course, the chair of the Anglican Treaty. These amazing minds, Professor Winiata, these amazing minds were both leading the Māori Renaissance and strongly influencing the church and talking with people like Bishop Paul at the time. And the Waitangi Tribunal's work was just starting to kick in. It took a long time for it to actually get into action because it was underfunded and the process was messy. But the Motunui report on Taranaki, on the desperation, desecration, I suppose, of the kaimana beds in Taranaki and the iwi Te Aotearoa. And so Paul was from Te Aotearoa. So these, all these things were coming together in a kind of a, depends how you want to describe it, a perfect storm, a blessing, however you want to describe it. All these events were working together. And it came together in 1990 with the Pauhi, the Constitution, the revised Constitution of our church. But this is an updated version, so I'm going to tweak it a little bit along the way. And whereas, by the Treaty of, so these are some selected parts out of our church constitution. So the first constitution was signed, anyone know? 1857, no woman, no Māori, signed the Judges Bay in Auckland, and pretty much just set up the church in England, Ireland, and Scotland here. Quite disappointed it was so far away from the original England, Ireland, and Scotland original. This was, and it wasn't revised till 1990. And whereas, by the Treaty of Waitangi signed in 1840, the basis for future government and settlement of New Zealand was agreed, which treaty implies partnership between Māori and settlers and bicultural development within one nation. There was a lot of lead-up work to this, but this is the Constitution, so it acknowledges the place of the treaty. And whereas the principles of partnership and bicultural development require the Church to A, organise its affairs within each of the tikanga, social organisations, languages, laws, principles and procedure of each partner, B, be diligent in prescribing, keeping open all avenues, leaving common ground, and C, maintain the right of every person to choose any particular cultural expression of the faith. So, we read from B. Remember, we didn't see the figures that well, but you know the biggest ever membership of the Anglican Church in New Zealand was 1985. That's when our numbers peaked. And it was something like 750,000 New Zealanders describing themselves as Anglican. And remember, that's out of a much smaller population than today, probably out of about 3 million. So when the Anglican Church did something, it meant quite a bit. And when it did something like this, it meant a lot. People paid attention. In 2021, we actually had to remind ourselves that once people cared what we did. And let's be honest about where we are today. But it was extremely important. It was extremely conservative. I was a General Senate representative in 1994. As a young man, it was ridiculous. All these judges and stuff like that, you had to walk backwards out of the room and stuff. I was like, what is this craziness? Everyone was like a Bill and Titchell, and we still do that stuff. But it was, a lot of the elite of New Zealand society in that General Senate room. It's extremely influential. It's important to think about what this took to get through to that particular audience. Just like after 1928, this was Eddie Jury and Pukehinahina and others, and the absolute genius guiding us through to a successful conclusion. Now look at it. The principles of partnership and bicultural development require us to organise our affairs within each of the tikanga of each partner. I would today use the term marketing. I just want to quickly marketing. I'll come back to why I'm using that term now. I think it's a different, terms evolve, gets different kind of weighting meaning. But I would say it's acknowledging the mātauranga of each partner is the way we will govern ourselves. But we'll keep that common ground open, as we do today, John. And we'll maintain the right of every person to choose any particular cultural expression of the faith. When Tainui signed the first treaty settlement, there was a principle invoked in that settlement, built into that settlement, that the beneficiaries of the settlement essentially had to be by descent, by direct whakapapa. They had to claim direct ancestral connection to Tainui to benefit from that. That has carried on through settlements. Now we might think, of course, Ngāti Porou got ourselves in trouble because we're just too clever. But in our settlement we said, for example, we run the whole of the health system effectively on the East Coast. And they said, well, if only descendants of Ngāti Porou can claim access to the hospital. So I had a good point to think about that for a second. But there was this idea, right, you had to descend. Now, that was always unusual for me. I grew up in Mihinare. I have several iwi, one of which is Mihinare, which we might call Anglican. I grew up with uncles and aunties from the north, from Maikapako, from Ngāti Kuri, from Tainui, from all around the place. I couldn't really tell the difference between them and my whakapapa aunties and uncles, and I didn't want to split the difference either. But I get told nowadays, don't call them auntie because they're not your auntie. And that is actually, I think, a recent development that's a little bit, anyway, that's a thing I think we need to think about. But look at this. You're not in your tīkanga because of your ethnicity or because of who you descend from. You're there entirely by choice. And you go to a lot of Pākehā parishes, tīkanga Pākehā parishes, you'll find Māori who chose to stay. You don't find so many Pākehā who stay in tīkanga Māori parishes around the country. Probably partly I think the preponderance are here, but there were a lot, particularly originally, around the north as well. Even the microphone sitting. Just think of the implications of this thing. A church built on mātara. A church that acknowledges those world views and reality. We also included the Diocese of Polynesia. Somehow bicultural became three, because we're theology, not maths. So we went from a bicultural church that has three together. It's a mystery. It's the perichoresis. The way of every Holy Trinity sermon. It was about autonomy, and I'm going to use that word, tīranga, but it was allowing Māori, for us it was liberation. There's a great story, I wasn't there when they first passed this. They had, everyone stood applauded. Māori went off and had this huge party, like an awesome party to end all parties. Because for us it had been decades and decades. And I'm not kidding this time, there are some incredibly sad stories in here of our past. And what my tikuna had to go through to be part of our faith. But, so we might have an amazing party. Pacifica came to join us, but why not? We're all the same moment. The old tradition I hear is Pākehā sat there, kind of stunned, said, what do we do? We've kind of lost our Māori in some ways. What do we do? Now, from a Māori perspective, not that we didn't care, but Pākehā had all the power for an awfully long time. It wasn't really our first concern. You'll be right. And I think at the time and for decades and for a long time afterwards, a lot of Māori were like, they're Pākehā, they just do their thing. It's awesome. It'll just still be fine. There was no kind of question of what that meant for Pākehā, to be Pākehā in this land. Because remember, we're going to take our will, we're going to take our mātauranga, our connection with the whenua, our manaakitanga, that's ours. We're going to go do that over there. You're going to be Pākehā over there. Enjoy. You've been pretty good at it so far. You've been telling us we can't do our thing. Now, surely this is what you're after, right? Surely this is great. And Pacifica, they'll just enjoy the maths. Of course, it was unfair in terms of resources, right? And this is an old figure, but it often stands true. I use an analogy of a divorce. Tīranga Pākehā said, yes, we'll have an equitable divorce. In terms of resources, you take whatever you can carry, and we'll stay here in the house with the car and the boat and stuff. So we got to take the microwave and the dog and other bits of jewellery, and that's actually the immense resources, particularly at the local level of the Pākehā Church, is just spectacular. And we've got nothing. We don't have paid clergy. Our ministers are all voluntary. We can't. We just don't. And Tīkanga Pākehā wealth is often from our land, which we gave for the establishment of this church. Local diocese was founded by us, giving of what we had. Anyway, but we kind of, I don't just want to sit on that just because things are happening on resources that are quite interesting. Do a constant calls for repeal reunification. The Hobson's Beach crowd in the church. I won't talk about that too much. I want to talk about this to finish. And I promise I'll finish before more alarms go. Tell Hunter, shut up, to the Prime Minister. The Waitangi Tribunal Y262. Now, Ngāti Porou produced, I'm just the biggest fanboy of justice, Sir Joe Williams. And I can't believe he's not Ngāti Porou. I just is just so good. I just pretend he is, basically. He knows more Ngāti Porou waiata than me for starters. Like, he's just, and he followed on from Te Hāhi Mihinare. And not just in terms of taking up the role, but taking up that responsibility. Look, as I said before, I'm Anglican. I can't imagine doing anything else. But if I did have another church I belong to, it's the Church of Y262, of which Joe Williams is our Moses figure I've decided, and I'm an evangelist. So in the last 2 minutes, I'm sitting on this. Y262 was a long, drawn-out Waikato tribunal claim around kind of flora and fauna, intellectual property rights and knowledge. It was huge. Iwi saying, and it started over Kumara being taken to Japan. It's a long, amazing story, and it's actually really boring, and don't ever listen to the lawyer talk about it. I love David Williams, but he'll bore you to death. So listen to that. Y262, at its heart, though, was about mātauranga, about knowledge, and about the place of mātauranga here in Aotearoa, right? Ostensibly about everything from artworks to international instruments like space treaties to, it's just massive, 800 pages of boring lawyer talk, but it's got some of the most amazing stuff tucked away in it. It's a claim about mātauranga Māori, the unique Māori way of viewing the world, incorporating both Māori culture and Māori traditional knowledge. It was the first one that looked all across government, as opposed to just aspects of government. The title of the Y262 was a number of the claim. It's that boring. It was a 262nd claim in. It was actually many claims, but they just heaped it under that one name. And the Waitaki Tribunal issued its report, which is called Ko Aotearoa Tēnei, This is New Zealand. It has both of those, that is the whole title. It's not either or, it's not a translation, it's both those names. That's really important to think about. And with that title, it's doing something really clever. It's saying, Ko Aotearoa Tēnei. Literally, this is Aotearoa. And it's saying, this is New Zealand. Simultaneously, it's saying these things. That's me and Joe Williams. I'm not staring at him in rapture. I'm managing to look away for a minute. That's great. The settlement process, the tribunal, the treaty is kind of in a bit of an interesting place at the moment. We're using it as a kind of a hammer to fix the holes in the waka. All the historical leaking. We're saying that's not good enough. We need to fix it. And yes, it's been completely inadequate and unjust and all that, absolutely. The settlements are pitiful, not enough, etc. Yep, but that's what we've been doing, and we've been trying, and we shouldn't be zero-sum about it. But the tribunal says what comes next after the settlement phase. Because a lot of us think it's going to go away. Once you get these national talks like that, once these settlements are done, the treaty will stop annoying us, it will just go away. What was spoken, we're back to, what are we back to? Oh yeah, back there. The tribunal is saying, after the settlements, we need to think about that. And it needs to go from a breached contract, which is the way we've been treating it, to an exchange of solemn promises. The way I think about it, it goes from the lawyers to the theologians, to the philosophers. It goes from fixing things to the possibilities. That's where we're headed. I don't know if you saw in the Real Market Week, 1 million people signed up online to one of the initiatives. 1 million people. At the University of Auckland, among staff, we've got 400 staff. In my family, I sent out an email saying, we'd like to sign up to go on T-Day classes. And I thought, oh sweet, might get enough to fill the class. 6 minutes, I had to close it off. And we had a waiting list of about 80. You go to AUT, they've got waiting lists of hundreds to do real at the university. We are in the most spectacular historical phase that I'll deal with. Yes, incarceration rates are still terrible. Yes, If you're a Māori male aged over 60 and you have lung cancer, you're going to die. If you're a Pākehā, you've got a 50% chance of survival. Yes, we're still the poorest, most marginalised in this country, but things are still shifting. And the tribunal's talking about that. Where are we going to go with that? Where does Te Tiriti sit within that? It talks about Māori cultural identity as a founding pillar of our national project and a claim about how the future should look for Aotearoa. Now, many of us in this room are chronologically challenged. And we probably think we've seen enough and had enough. We've done our share, we've made our contribution, we've fought the good fight. But I kind of want to say to us, let's keep going. Particularly our Anglican Church. We did a really amazing thing in 1990, and then we stopped. You know what I reckon our problem is now in the Anglican Church, and then I get in trouble for this with my Māori whānau, is I think it's left tikanga Pākehā lost. We said to you, go be Pākehā. And we've got climate change, right? Climate change is an existential crisis. I kind of view it as a failure or the exhaustion of Western philosophy and theology. My niece got leukemia a few years ago. She was cured. It was absolutely amazing, the technology. Absolutely. I would call it a miracle. I don't know how else to describe that kind of technology. We can do the most amazing things, and yet we're absolutely destroying our planet. Because the why of things, the why of things we've lost along the way somewhere. I think, in this country anyway, as Māori, as people of this land, we've got some pretty good things to offer everyone else. It's kind of what Y262 is saying as well. Let's share this. Let's bring mātauranga into a shared foundation. Look, it freaks me out when I talk to a Pākehā who's got better level than me. It actually kind of scares me because I'm worried, what's next? You're going to tell me what the tikanga is? You're going to, please, not another round of this. But I'll tell you what, it's better than the past, where my language got dismissed as having no value, my identity got dismissed, my mātauranga got dismissed. I'd much rather it got embraced than it got dismissed. And as a church, I think we've got some work to do again. Sorry. And for those of you who took part in 1990, absolutely amazing generation, seriously, groundbreaking, prophetic, in all those good ways, that we didn't follow. I don't know. I think in the Māori side we were exhausted. I sat there with Bishop Pukehinahina and there. They were just kaupau te hau. They'd been fighting a liberation struggle for decades. And they'd won enough. They didn't have the energy to take it wherever it needed to go next day. So they just, it's a long story what they did in our leadership. But we need to renew that. And I think Y262 is a way I haven't seen that's thoughtful, credible, optimistic, hopeful, generous, all those kind of Christian things we like to talk about as well, that offers us an opportunity to take this forward. So I'm just talking about Te Tiriti and remembering that place of mātauranga being, I think, a reading of its foundational intent and purpose. And we need to renew our understanding of the treaty because it doesn't get locked in that mode of negotiation and repatriation. Instead, we take it something more positive. So I leave with those thoughts. Also, suddenly, can I mention the Archbishop said, just sits alongside the Rawi and the Pakeha. I think he could lose his role for that, but I'm willing to go with it. But I think, for me too, we don't get to do our future without understanding more about our past. So we've got the compulsory schools curriculum coming. We're trying to do some work as a church about, and something really helpful and useful with our generations of tamariki and mokopuna about learning our stories. I know John does some fantastic work here around that, but we don't get to do our future without our history. We don't leave it behind. It's not a burden, we just get to dump it on the way it's going to inform us in our journey. And we need to know much, much more than just this. We all need to know our local stories, how our whakapapa intersects with the treaty, with this story as well. So,
Where do we buy it?
eh?
Where do we buy it?
You can buy it from any good bookshop and Whitcourts. They do sell a lot of Whitcourts. You can order it online. Oh look, there's a link. But it is weird, a lot of Whitcourts. What I also ask, if you go buy it, go in and grab it and put it at the front if you're going to it. Just shop it, that's what it is, not fuss thing. As long as it gets in your hands. You can also buy the e-book version, which is cheaper, but not such a pound. But it's just, again, whatever our stories are, we need to keep telling them, we need to keep learning from them, because they're incredibly powerful, transformative as well. And Tātipuna region was part of the bicultural journey. It was very Tātipuna. He did this kind of contrary report, the bicultural report. And he said, we can't build a church just on guilt. I think that's one of our challenges with our past. We need to build our church on hope as well, and offer that to our communities and those in need and the larger ones. So we need to understand, and standing here for Pukehinahina, we understand very well about guilt on that. I think about hope is a good challenge for us. So if you're
Kanui te mihi, kanui te aroha ki a koe mō tō kōrero, mō tō tauranga i tēnei pō. Thank you for your words, thank you for your knowledge, thank you for your challenge, and the offering of some different ways of imagining our future. I guess that's partly what we're trying to offer with these lectures. Actually, yes, we need to know our past, but not to be weighed down by guilt. I mean, as I said, I think the very first one, somebody didn't come because they didn't want to be weighed down by guilt. I don't want anyone to be weighed down by guilt, but I want us to imagine a better future. And we can only imagine a better future when we know our past. And part of that is the pain of the past, but also some of the hope and the promise that is held in our past, and how do we live that out? How do we capture that and bring it to fruition so that all might thrive and flourish. So that's enough of my sermon. Those who were here this morning. So I just wanted to offer you this little putia to say, little koha, to say thank you for both the time you spent travelling, the time you spent putting this together, the time you spent trying to work out how to weave your book ads in the middle of it all, and, but also just sharing yourself and your passion and your energy and your creativity in all of this. So thank you very much. So thank you all very much for coming. That's it for this year. Now we've come up with some great speakers for next year. For those who weren't able to come, if you can tell them that one day in the next few weeks, the video will appear on the YouTube channel, and the audio should come up a bit sooner. I think I now have enough time on my podcast things that actually go up this week. So the audio will appear quickly, the video will take a couple of. So thank you all again for coming. We really appreciate the support you've given us. And buy his book. Please remember to buy his book.